Good afternoon. Pastor Travis from A Faithful Dad. We are a ministry that encourages dads and families right where they are, based in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and so glad to be bringing you this message. This is our video, part of our video ministry called A Faithful Dad Speaks, and we have teasers that lead up to the main day, which is today, the main message. And the message today is this: why is the Old Testament of Joseph so compelling? I mean, this story was written maybe 3,000 plus years ago. And it wasn't, obviously wasn't in English. And it just jumps off the page. I mean, when I read this story, it basically starts in Genesis chapter 37, goes through chapter 50. There's a break in Genesis chapter 38 with Judah and Tamar, the fourth born son of Jacob and his daughter-in-law. But for the most part, it is just a race to the finish. And every time I get to Genesis 45, and it's specifically, at least in the version I'm reading, it's called Joseph Reveals Himself to His Brothers. In other words, if you've been living under a rock, you already know the story, but real quick overview is Joseph is a 17-year-old boy when we meet him. He's the 11th son of Jacob, and he is younger than the other brothers. Jacob has two wives, and each of those wives has a maidservant. Things were different in biblical times, so there were eventually 12 boys to these four ladies, and Benjamin is the final one. But Joseph, he's young, and he's following his brothers around, and almost you kind of get the feeling that he's kind of a pest. And the number one point, before I go on my point, the scripture I'm going to tie this to is Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, where at the very end of the story, in Genesis 50, the last chapter of Genesis, his brothers are up to their conniving ways again. And Joseph says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good and to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. So I'm not going to go through the whole story of Joseph. I want you, that's my challenge. I'll say my challenge now. I want you to read the story of Joseph from Genesis chapter 37 through Genesis chapter 50. You don't have to read it one day, but it is such a beautiful story. And the point I was making is number one, we identify with Joseph. I mean, when I read Joseph in what's going on in chapter 45, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, I bawl. Such a mess. I mean, I have nowhere in scripture, well, not true, the resurrection, but it's such an emotional story because number one, we identify with Joseph. We can kind of see what he's going through, that he's kind of he's young and his brothers are looking down on him, and he's in some regards being a tattletale when his dad's putting him up to it. And quite frankly, the dad is favoring Joseph over the other boys. That's one of the probably the biggest reason on earth why that was such a problem, because Joseph was favored by his dad, and his dad made him a coat of many colors. And it wasn't just that the brothers were upset with Joseph, they were upset with Jacob because Jacob was favoring one of the boys. And that never leads to good things. If you can say anything about the Bible characters, they are human to the core, just like you and I are. So number one, we identify with Joseph. We can identify with that comeuppance that he's talking, the dreams. Now they're being sold into slavery and being mistreated, being thrown in jail, being accused. Very difficult, very difficult. And I think that's that whole human element, again, 3,000 years ago, plus, we can still understand what that feels like. And that leads me to my second point. Why is the Old Testament story of Joseph so compelling? And number 2 point is this: Joseph is a Christ-like figure. Now, there have been PhDs and studies on this. I have not done mine, nor I don't think I intend to. But there's so many parallels between Joseph and Jesus. And I would even make the statement that of all the characters in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in my opinion, I believe Joseph is the most Christ-like figure. There's so many attributes he has. He was born into a family, just a few just off the top of my head. He was born into a family of brothers. He was sold into slavery, and Jesus himself was sold for 30 pieces of silver. He was accused. Joseph was accused by Potiphar's wife of trying to make a sport of her, to try to have him go to bed with her. It was just the opposite. Joseph was running. Jesus himself was accused. He was accused by the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and he was left for dead. And Jesus himself on the cross did indeed die. And then, so there are so many elements of that I see in that. And when you're reading this, again, my encouragement, my challenge is when you're reading through this, you're gonna, it's going to hit you like a 2x4. There's so many things, there's so many aspects of Joseph that will remind you of Christ. Now, Joseph is not without sin. Jesus is. But there are so many parallels that make it enjoyable to read. And one of the sayings that I'm most fond of is, you'll hear this, the Old Testament is Jesus concealed. The New Testament is Jesus revealed. And I love that because it's so true, because there's so many things that are going on, so many stories, so many incidences of Christ-like behavior and Christ-like figures. And again, my supposition here is that, assertion rather, is that yes, indeed, Joseph is a Christ-like figure. And number 3, the third point I want to make is this. Through the Joseph story, as gut-wrenching as it is, and as highs and lows, we see the hint of God's plan of redemption. And that is just delicious, because Joseph is going through all these troubles, all these trials. He's separated from his dad, and he's separated from his brothers, from his homeland. He's no one knows who he is. And yet, God used Joseph, who rose second in command only to Pharaoh, because Joseph was able to interpret his dreams, and because most of all, God allowed him to do so, and also allowed him to have that ability to save his people. I mean, at the very end of the story, like I said, the key verse, Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, after Jacob has died and the brothers are still conspiring against, in a little bit, they're still in their conniving ways. They're thinking, okay, well, now that dad's dead, what this means is now Joseph's finally going to he's going to get even with us. So they made up a story that, hey, Joseph, dad said you're not supposed to touch us, and you're supposed to forgive us. And it says in the text, Joseph wept. Whether he was weeping for joy, probably just weeping out of frustration. And he exclaims this, Genesis 50:20, you intended to harm me. In other words, you sold me into slavery to get rid of me. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good and to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. There were 7 years of good harvest and 7 years of famine, and the famine was so great that the 7 years of good harvest were not remembered. And Joseph, God working through Joseph, saved his family and brought the Israelites down to Egypt, where the redemption story, you know where this goes. It's just beautiful. And it started with Joseph. And the Israelites would go from, it said, I think there was 70 in all that went down there initially, and it rose to between 1.5 and 2 million at 430 years later it was. But incredible part of the redemption plan, God's redemption plan. It would bring them out. And again, we're still in that redemption plan. So here it is in 2021, and we're still part of that redemption plan because God is still sovereign. So again, number 1, remember that we identify with Joseph. Number 2, Joseph is a Christ-like figure. And number 3, in the story of Joseph, we see God's redemptive plan. I said my challenge was going to be this. I'm going to challenge you to read Genesis chapter 37 through 50 and just glorify what God is doing through it. It's a beautiful story. And any questions, any concerns, any comments, any Bible verses you want to share, reach out to me, Travis@afaithfuldad.org. And any prayer requests you have, happy to do so. Love you, Jesus. Look forward to seeing you next week. God bless. Bye.